The smell of motor oil and sawdust hit me the moment I stepped into my father's garage. It was the same smell I remembered from childhood Saturday mornings watching him tinker with engines he'd never quite fix, humming old country songs under his breath. Now the garage was silent, and he was gone, and I was standing there in the same dress I'd worn to his funeral, trying to hold myself together while my brother circled the room like he was taking inventory. Dad had died on a Tuesday, quietly, the way he'd lived. A heart attack in his sleep, the doctors said, which somehow made it worse. No warning, no goodbye, no final conversation where he could have told me what he was thinking when he wrote that will. My brother, Derek, was 3 years older than me and had spent most of his adult life making sure everyone in the room knew it. He was the kind of man who answered questions no one asked and gave advice no one wanted. He had driven up from Dallas the morning after Dad passed, arriving at the house with his wife, Cheryl, who wore expensive perfume and spoke only in tight, polished sentences that somehow always landed as insults. The reading of the will happened at the kitchen table, handled by Dad's attorney, a quiet man named Paul Mercer who had driven 40 minutes from his office in Knoxville and looked like he'd seen this kind of tension before. Mom sat beside me, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had gone cold an hour ago. Derek sat across from us, one arm draped over the back of his chair like he was at a business lunch. Paul read through the first part without incident. The house went to Mom. The savings account was split, a few personal items designated to specific people. Then he got to the last paragraph. To my daughter, Claire, I leave the workshop property on Ridgeline Road, including the building, all tools and equipment, and the 2 acres of land it sits on. The room went quiet. Derek's arms slid off the back of his chair. He leaned forward, and for a second, I thought maybe he'd let it go. Maybe he'd be decent about it just this once. He wasn't. He let out a short, sharp laugh that had nothing funny in it. The workshop? He looked at me with something between pity and contempt. Dad left you his junk pile, Claire. That thing hasn't been operational in 15 years. The roof leaks. There's probably raccoons living in the walls. He paused, just long enough for it to land. Guess it suits you, though. Always did like crawling around in the dirt. Cheryl put her hand on his arm. Not to stop him, to steady herself from laughing. Mom stared at the table. Paul Mercer cleared his throat and looked down at his documents. I kept my face still. I'd learned that from watching Dad. He never let anyone see him rattled, not once. He always said reactions were currency, don't spend them cheap. Congratulations on the house, Mom, I said. I stood up, folded my hands in front of me, and walked out the front door before Derek could say another word. The afternoon was gray, the kind of cold that settles into your bones in late October in Tennessee. I sat on the porch steps and looked out at the yard, at the old oak tree Dad had put a swing in when I was 7. The swing was still there, rope frayed, seat warped. He hadn't taken it down. He never threw anything away. Derek came out 20 minutes later. He stood behind me like he was waiting for me to turn around and argue. You know it's not personal, he said. You called me dirt, Derek. I said you like the dirt. Different thing. He sounded almost amused. Look, Claire, I'm trying to be reasonable here. That workshop property is useless. It's a liability, not an asset. You can't run a business, you don't have capital, and you've never managed anything larger than your apartment lease. He moved to lean against the porch railing, looking down at me. Let me handle the sale. I've already got a contact at a commercial real estate firm in Knoxville. We split whatever it sells for, clean and simple. You get cash, I get the headache off your shoulders. I looked up at him. Dad left it to me. Dad left you a broken-down building out of sentiment. Don't make a sentimental decision with a financial asset. I'll think about it, I said. He looked at me the way he'd looked at me my whole life, like I was a problem that hadn't been solved yet. Then he went back inside. That night, I lay in my childhood bedroom staring at the ceiling and thought about every reason Derek was probably right. I was 31 years old and worked as a project coordinator for a mid-size architectural firm in Knoxville. I had savings but not wealth. I'd never renovated a building, never managed a property, never done anything that would qualify me to take on a crumbling workshop alone. But Dad had left it to me. On purpose. Knowing exactly what shape it was in. He wasn't a careless man. He didn't do things without a reason. The next morning, I drove out to Ridgeline Road by myself. The workshop sat at the end of a gravel drive bordered by cedar trees. The building was larger than I remembered, maybe 4,000 square feet of corrugated metal siding and timber framing, set on a concrete foundation that looked solid even if the rest wasn't. The roof sagged in one corner. A rusted padlock hung on the front door. Weeds had pushed through the gravel, and a section of the guttering had come loose and swung free from one end. Derek wasn't wrong about the raccoons. I heard at least 2 of them scrambling inside when I knocked on the wall. But I also noticed things he wouldn't have bothered to. The foundation was clean, no cracks, no water damage along the base. The timber posts visible through a broken side window were solid, no rot at ground level. The land itself sloped gently down toward a tree line, and through the cedars I could see a glint of something. Water. A creek, I thought, though I couldn't remember Dad ever mentioning one. I found the key in a magnetic box stuck under the rear bumper of an old truck chassis parked behind the building. Dad had left it there deliberately. He'd sent me a letter 2 months before he died, one of those handwritten ones he'd drop in the mail whenever he had something to say that felt too important for a text. The letter had mentioned the key, mentioned the truck, mentioned that he hoped I'd come out and see the place for myself before I made any decisions. I'd thought he was being nostalgic. I hadn't understood yet. The lock turned on the first try. Inside, the smell of sawdust and oil was even stronger than in the garage at home. Afternoon light cut through gaps in the roof in long amber shafts, landing on rows of old workbenches, shelving units, a woodworking lathe, a band saw under a tarp. Tools hung on pegboard along one wall, sorted with a precision that told me someone had organized them recently. Not years ago. Recently. I walked slowly through the space, trailing my fingers along the edge of a workbench. Everything was dusty but not neglected. The equipment was older but well maintained. Against the far wall, stacked neatly on a shelf, were labeled binders. I pulled one out, maintenance logs going back 12 years. Dad had kept meticulous records of every piece of equipment in this building. He'd been taking care of this place long after everyone assumed he'd abandoned it. At the back of the workshop, past a set of double doors that opened onto the creek I'd spotted, I found a small office, a metal desk, a filing cabinet, a corkboard covered in notes and photographs, and on the desk, sitting directly in the center, a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in my father's handwriting. I sat down in his chair and opened it. Claire, if you're reading this here, then you came out to see it for yourself instead of just taking Derek's word for it. That tells me everything I needed to know. I've been sitting on information about this property for 3 years, waiting for the right time to act on it. Now the time is yours, not mine. In the bottom drawer of this desk, you'll find a folder with a yellow tab. Don't skip ahead. Read the whole thing in order. And before you make any decisions, call Margaret Olson. Her number is on the inside cover. She helped me put the legal structure in place, and she knows what to do next. I love you. I'm proud of you. Don't let your brother manage anything that belongs to you. Dad. I read it twice. Then I opened the bottom drawer. The folder was there, just as he said, thick with documents. I pulled it out and set it on the desk and started reading from the first page. By the time I finished, my hands were shaking. 3 years ago, during a county-wide land assessment, a geological survey had been conducted across a broad section of eastern Knox County and into the neighboring parcels. The survey had flagged the Ridgeline Road property specifically. Under the 2 acres of land and extending beneath the workshop floor were significant deposits of high-grade feldspar and quartz aggregate materials used in ceramic manufacturing, glass production, and increasingly, in certain components of battery technology. The county assessor's follow-up notes estimated the mineral extraction value in preliminary terms. The number on that page had 6 figures in front of the decimal, and the word preliminary was underlined twice, suggesting the actual valuation could run higher. There was a second document behind it, a letter from a materials company based in Ohio, addressed to my father, dated 8 months ago. They had learned of the survey. They were interested in a long-term extraction agreement. The terms they'd outlined were not a buyout, they were a royalty-structured partnership. Ongoing income tied to what was pulled from the ground, with the landowner retaining full property rights. Dad had never signed it. He'd written a single word in the margin in red pen, Claire. He had waited. He had held it for me. I sat in his chair in his office in his workshop for a long time. Outside, the creek ran quiet behind the cedar trees, and somewhere in the rafters above me the raccoons scratched around, unbothered. Then I called Margaret Olson. She picked up on the second ring, like she'd been expecting it. Claire Whitfield, she said warmly. Your father told me you'd call soon. I'm glad you did. He left me more than a workshop, I said. He left you exactly what he intended to leave you, she said. How much have you read? All of it. Good. Then you already know that the deed is clean, the mineral rights are intact, and your name is the only one on any of it. Derek has no legal claim. Neither does anyone else. There was a brief pause. Your father was very thorough. He came to me 18 months ago specifically to make sure there were no gaps. 18 months. He had known he was running out of time, though he hadn't said so. He had spent 18 months making sure I couldn't be outmaneuvered. What do I do now? I asked. First, she said, don't tell anyone what you've found. Not your mother, not Derek, not anyone you don't completely trust. Second, come to my office this week and we'll file the protective documentation. Third, respond to the Ohio company and let them know you're the new point of contact. Another pause, shorter. And Claire, your father was right to choose you. Don't doubt that. I drove home in the dark with the folder on the passenger seat and the windows cracked, the cold air sharp against my face. My phone buzzed twice. Derek both times. I let both go to voicemail. He called again the next morning, early, before I'd had coffee. This time I answered. I've been thinking, he said, without preamble. The Ridgeline property needs to move fast if we're going to get anything for it. The market in that corridor is soft, but it won't stay soft. I've had my contact pull some comps. We're probably looking at low 200s for a distressed commercial property on 2 acres, which isn't nothing. Split evenly. I'm not selling, I said. Silence. Claire. I heard you, Derek. I'm not selling. His voice sharpened. You're being emotional. Dad left you something that has sentimental value to you because it was his space. I understand that, but sentimental value doesn't pay property taxes. I'll manage. You can't manage that property. You have no experience, no capital, no... I have a lawyer, I said. Her name is Margaret Olson. If you or your real estate contact make any inquiries about the Ridgeline property, please direct them to her. A long silence. Then, careful and flat. Where is this coming from? Dad, I said. And I hung up. 2 days later, I was at Margaret's office in Knoxville, signing documents I'd read 3 times each before touching the pen. She walked me through the filing structure. Dad had outlined a property trust, with me as sole trustee and beneficiary. The mineral rights were recorded separately, clearly, in language Margaret described as bulletproof. The Ohio company's letter of interest was on record. A formal response had gone out under my name the previous afternoon, acknowledging receipt and requesting 30 days to review terms. Walking out of her office into the cold November air, I felt something settle in my chest. It wasn't euphoria. It was steadier than that. It was the feeling of standing on ground that belonged to me. Derek must have done some digging, because by the following weekend, he showed up at Mom's house with Cheryl and a man I didn't recognize. 40s, pressed slacks, the kind of confident handshake that said money more than warmth. He introduced himself as a commercial property developer with a firm out of Nashville. Said he'd heard about the Ridgeline property through a mutual contact. Said he was prepared to make a cash offer, quick close, no contingencies. He said this directly to me, in Mom's living room, with Derek sitting across from me like he'd arranged the whole thing. Which he had. Mom watched from the kitchen doorway. I appreciate the visit, I said. My attorney handles all inquiries related to the property. Derek's jaw tightened. Claire. This man drove 2 hours. I didn't ask him to. The developer kept his composure better than Derek did. He slid a card across the coffee table, said he hoped I'd reconsider, and then excused himself to wait in the car. Probably wise. The room had dropped 10 degrees. You're embarrassing yourself, Derek said, once the front door had closed. And you're embarrassing this family. I'm protecting what Dad left me. If that embarrasses you, that's your problem. Cheryl cleared her throat softly. We're only trying to help you be practical, Claire. What you're trying to do, I said, looking between them, is take something that isn't yours. I don't know how to be polite about that anymore. Derek stood up. You know what Dad really left you? A burden. Something he felt guilty about, probably, because he knew you'd never amount to anything without a hand up. That workshop isn't a gift, Claire. It's charity. Don't confuse the two. The words sat in the air for a second. I felt them land. I won't pretend they didn't. But I also remembered what Margaret had said when I'd told her about Derek. Some people mistake your patience for weakness. Let them. It gives you time to finish building your case. Drive safe, I said. Derek stormed out. Cheryl followed without looking at me. Mom came in from the kitchen and sat down in the armchair across from the couch. She looked older than she had at the funeral, somehow. Smaller. She folded her hands and looked at me. He's not entirely wrong that it's a difficult property, she said, carefully. Dad didn't think so. Your father had plans for a lot of things that never came together. This one did, I said. He made sure of it before he died. She searched my face. What aren't you telling me? Nothing I'm not ready to tell yet. But I promise you I know what I'm doing, and Dad knew what he was doing when he left it to me. She was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded. Slowly, in the way that meant she wasn't fully convinced, but she was choosing to trust me. It was more than I'd expected. The weeks that followed were the busiest of my life. Between my regular work, I was driving out to Ridgeline 2 and 3 times a week. I'd hired a structural engineer who confirmed what I'd suspected: the bones of the building were solid. The roof needed work, 2 sections of siding needed replacement, and the electrical panel was outdated but functional. The repair costs were significant but not ruinous, and Margaret had helped me structure a small bridge loan against the mineral rights valuation. I wasn't spending money I didn't have. I was spending against what I was about to have. The Ohio company came back with formal terms in December. I sat with Margaret for 3 hours going through the contract line by line. The royalty percentage was fair. The surface disturbance terms were acceptable. The duration was long, with renegotiation clauses at intervals that protected me. We countered on 2 points. They accepted both, and by the second week of December, I had signed my name to an agreement that would generate ongoing income from the ground beneath my father's workshop for the foreseeable future. I called Mom that evening. She answered on the 3rd ring. The property is going to be fine, I said. More than fine. I want to tell you about it, but I need you to hear it without telling Derek first. A pause. Then, all right. I walked her through the basic outline, not every number, but enough. The survey, the minerals, the agreement, the legal protections Dad had set up. She was quiet for most of it. When I finished, she was still quiet for a long moment. He never told me, she finally said, about any of it. I think he was afraid it would get complicated. You know how Derek gets. I do, she said softly. I've always known. I just hoped she stopped. I'm sorry, Claire. I should have said something when he made that comment at the table. About the dirt. I should have said something right then. Yeah, I said, you should have. It wasn't the time for a full accounting of it, and she wasn't ready for one, and neither was I, but the honesty of it mattered. She'd said it. I'd heard it. What are you going to do with the workshop? She asked. Fix it up, rent the space to small craftsmen and makers, woodworkers, metal fabricators, that kind of thing. The building is designed for exactly that kind of use. The rental income plus the mineral royalties means the property supports itself. I paused. And eventually, I want to use a portion of the land to build something. A small resource center, maybe. For people starting out, first-generation business owners, women, veterans, people who need tools and space more than they need a loan. Silence. Then her voice quieter. Your father would love that. I know, I said. I think that's part of why he left it to me. The confrontation with Derek came in January. I didn't plan it, but I didn't avoid it either. He called and demanded I meet him for lunch, which I understood as his way of trying to control the venue. So I suggested the workshop instead. He paused, then agreed, probably assuming he'd use the state of the property to make his point. When he pulled up and saw the new roof visible from the drive, clean metal panels still bright in the winter light, he didn't say anything right away. He got out of his truck and walked toward the building slowly. I opened the front door from the inside and waited. The interior had been cleaned out, the broken equipment removed, the floor swept and clear, the windows replaced. It smelled like sawdust still, but fresh now, purposeful. The tools Dad had maintained were back on their pegboard hooks, labeled and organized. The double doors at the back were open, and the creak was audible, a low, constant sound that made the space feel alive. Derek stood in the middle of it and looked around without speaking. I had the structural inspection completed in November, I said. The building is sound. Roof replaced in December. Electrical updated last week. The first tenant signs a lease next month, a furniture maker who's been working out of his garage for 4 years. Derek turned to look at me. His expression was hard to read, not angry, not exactly, more like recalibrating. The property is also the subject of a mineral extraction agreement, I said. I won't go into details, but it's structured as royalties. It generates income without requiring a sale. He absorbed this. Dad knew. Dad arranged it. He looked away, at the open back doors and the line of cedar trees beyond the creek. Something crossed his face that might have been grief, or might have been regret, or both. He didn't tell me, Derek said. Not accusing anyone. Just saying it. He didn't trust that you'd let me keep it if you knew, I said. I tried to say it plainly, not as an attack. That's not a small thing, Derek. You need to know I'm aware of that. He pressed his lips together. I wasn't trying to steal from you. You were trying to manage something that wasn't yours to manage. Which isn't quite the same thing, but it's close enough that Dad felt he needed to protect me from it. In writing. With a lawyer, 18 months before he died. The silence that followed was the kind that needed to run its course. I let it. Eventually he said, "What do you need from me?" "Nothing," I said. "That's not why I'm telling you. I'm telling you because you're my brother and eventually we're going to have to be in the same room without it feeling like a standoff." He nodded slowly. He didn't apologize, not directly, not then. Maybe later, maybe never in the way I'd want. But he nodded and that was something. He walked back through the building on his way out. Pausing at the pegboard of tools, running his hand along the edge of a workbench the same way I had the first time I'd come. Maybe remembering the same things I had. Saturday mornings, the smell of sawdust, the sound of Dad humming something tuneless under his breath. At the door he stopped. "He was proud of you," Derek said, without turning around. "He talked about you more than you probably knew." Then he walked to his truck and drove down the gravel road without looking back. I stood in the workshop for a long time after the sound of his engine faded. The creak murmured through the open doors. The new roof held the gray January sky. The tools waited on their hooks, ready. By spring, the space had its first 3 tenants: the furniture maker, a ceramic artist who needed kiln space, and a woman in her late 20s who repaired and restored vintage motorcycles with a precision that made watching her work feel like watching surgery. They were exactly the kind of people I'd pictured when I'd first sat in Dad's chair and started to understand what he'd left me. The resource center was still in the planning phase, but the plans were real now, drawn up by a firm, reviewed by the county, progressing through permitting. Margaret had helped me establish a nonprofit structure alongside the main property entity. We'd had our first donor meeting in March. 3 people had written checks before they left the table. On a Saturday in late April, I drove out to Ridgeline in the morning with 2 cups of coffee and no particular agenda. I unlocked the front door and walked through to the back and sat on the dock we'd built over the creek, just 4 boards and a railing, nothing fancy, but solid. I set the second cup down on the railing and looked at the water. Dad used to say that the things worth having were always harder to see at first. That their value wasn't obvious, that obvious things got picked over by obvious people, and what was left for the rest of you was everything they'd been too impatient to understand. I'd thought he was talking about engines when he said that. Old trucks. Machinery that looked broken but wasn't. He was talking about this. Somewhere behind me, the ceramic artist had come in on a weekend to finish a project, and the sound of her working drifted through the open back doors. The furniture maker's truck was in the lot. The motorcycle woman had left her jacket on the hook by the front entrance, which meant she'd be in later. My phone buzzed. A message from Mom. "Driving through that way this afternoon. Can I stop?" I wrote back, "I'll be here." I looked at the creek, at the way the morning light broke across the water into something more than the sum of its parts. I thought about Derek's face when he'd looked around the workshop the moment he'd stopped arguing and started seeing. I thought about Margaret's calm voice on the phone the first night I'd called, already prepared, already steady. I thought about Dad sitting at that desk in the back office, writing my name in red pen in the margin of a letter he'd never sent, deciding to hold it for me. I wasn't angry anymore. That surprised me. I'd expected the anger to last longer. But it was hard to stay furious, standing in the middle of something you'd built, something that hadn't existed before you chose not to walk away from it. Derek had called it a junk pile, a burden. Charity dressed up as an inheritance. He'd been wrong about what it was, but not entirely wrong that it would take everything I had. It had. It had taken patience and legal fees and hard conversations and early mornings, and the willingness to not fold when folding would have been so much easier. What he'd missed, what he'd always missed about me, maybe was that I didn't mind the hard part. I'd never needed easy. I just needed the chance. Dad had known that. He'd known it well enough to spend 18 months making sure no one could take the chance away before I got to use it. I picked up the second coffee cup from the railing and held it out over the water for a second. A small thing, a quiet thing. The kind of moment that doesn't make sense to explain to anyone who wasn't there. "Thank you," I said. The creek kept moving. The building settled behind me into the warmth of the morning, and somewhere in the back, the sound of someone making something real.